I like making boxes for books as well. I think that's particularly fun.
Hello, it's bookbindings podcast. Today we have a special guest. Emily Bell is well. You are at Wellesley College. You are said to be a collections conservator, but I understand that you are a book conservator. Is it right, or not only book conservator?
Oh, right. The books primarily, yes.
Okay, so, well, collections conservator, book conservator, and we are going to talk about book history quite a lot. And we have some questions, and both my co-host and I. And my co-host is Pavel. He joins us from Moscow. I'm Stepan. I'm in Leiden, at least for now. Hi.
Hi, everyone.
So I guess we will just dive in, and it's a bit upsetting for me that I saw your series only recently on the Guild of Bookworkers newsletters, because I guess we would have brought you as one of our first guests on our podcast, because book history is a topic that amazes both of us, and we have so many questions. So it's so great that you agreed to join us. And by the way, the thing that we were discussing in Russian before, at the moment you connected, was that it's a pity, at least for me, that in the list you sent us, one of the topics that I wanted to discuss with someone for quite a long time is adhesives. And this is the topic that isn't yet published.
That's true. You have to wait a little while for that one.
Yeah, we'll have to bring you back. So how did it all begin for you? I mean, with conservation, with I guess fascination of book history, and with this series, because it's an impressive work. It lasts for years, and I can't even imagine how much time you spent to write all these articles.
Yes, it's definitely something that I didn't expect to be as big as it is, and it has certainly kept growing as I've gotten more into it. I keep finding more things to talk about. So, but I can certainly back up even further and give you a little bit about myself from the beginning and how I got interested in bookbinding in the first place.
Yeah.
Actually, when I was in school, had no knowledge of conservation whatsoever. I was actually studying to be an engineer. I was a physics major as an undergraduate, and then I went to graduate school in materials science. And my plan, as is actually mentioned in the little tiny biography at the beginning of the first article there, is that I was going to build spaceships. This was my idea of a career. And as I was going through graduate school, I decided it wasn't quite the right fit for me. So I thought about, okay, well, what is it that I like about this, and what is it that I don't? And the thing that really I enjoyed was working in the lab. So that hands-on component of scientific work was something that I always found interesting. And I've always been a craft person. I always make stuff. So combining this scientific idea with making things, putting those two things together is what gave me the idea of conservation broadly. And I've always been a reader. I've always had a lot of books. I just moved, so I don't have a room set up right now that shows the extent of my collection. That's why I have a completely blank wall behind me. Well,
we see a press, so or something like that. Yeah. So there's something
that deserved to be in the shot.
I can relate, because we're moving to Paris, and it's a madhouse here, and well, just can't imagine how it goes. So this crafty side of yours, was it something that comes from your family, or from some special relative, or how did it go? How did it begin?
Yeah, that's actually kind of a fun story too. The thing that the book press is sitting on is actually my grandmother's sewing table, and the sewing machine itself was my great-grandmother's. So when I used to visit my grandmother, I was the one person who would actually dig out the sewing machine and use it. So my grandmother was very crafty. She made clothes for her kids, and she actually even made a fancy prom dress for my mom that I still have. So, so she was definitely a craft-oriented person too. So it's not too surprising that I kind of picked this up also. Yeah, it's funny because my mother is not particularly crafty. She's a little bit, but not the way that I am. I've always been trying to make stuff with my hands for as long as I can remember. So yeah, that's definitely something that's been part of my life for a long time.
Well, sometimes it skips a generation. At least in my case, my father is not crafty at all. Well, he probably was a bit crafty when he was much younger, even younger than I am at the moment. But I definitely got almost all of my stuffs and my skills from my grandfathers. Yeah.
So you decided to go into conservation immediately, or and how did it go? How did you become a conservator?
Right. Well, I left my graduate school program and moved across the country with my then boyfriend. We are now married, so we didn't kill each other on the way over. But we drove from California to Virginia, which is about as far as you can go.
Yeah.
With everything we owned in a truck. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I just started talking to as many conservators as I could get to talk to me in all kinds of different specialties. And I actually first got experience in textile conservation. So there's a museum in Washington, D.C. called the Textile Museum. And I had the great good fortune to talk to someone there who said, well, we could actually use a volunteer. So I got some great hands-on experience with her and with that collection pretty much right away. She was actually the very first conservator that I spoke to. I continued interviewing other conservators around the DC area, but it just worked out really nicely that I could volunteer there for a couple of days a week and learn a lot about what conservation was and how to take care of a museum collection. So that was kind of the earliest experience that I had. And in talking to other conservators, I came across a book conservator who worked at the University of Maryland, which is where I started in book conservation. And she was great. She taught me all kinds of things and really encouraged me to take classes and workshops and learn more and get some good on-the-job experience. So what really attracted me about books actually is that instead of being sort of a static object that, like a painting that sits on the wall and you look at it, but otherwise you don't interact with it, a book is something that has to be used and has to move and function in order to be usable and to convey its information. And so I take on this kind of mechanical approach to books, partly because of my science background, that I think is not uncommon, but is maybe not something that everybody thinks about. So it was a really good fit for me to have that mechanical component and that idea that a book needs to be manipulated and functional in order to be useful. So I really like that, and I like reading books, and I like making boxes for books as well. I think that's particularly fun. And especially, actually, I've gotten into working with archival materials in the college archives, and they have not just flat things and not just books, but they have objects. So there are some three-dimensional things that need to be stored, and they sometimes require some creative thinking about boxes and box making and how you can make a box that's functional and easy to use, but is also not really difficult to make, because we still need to be able to make these things within a reasonable amount of time. So, so that kind of challenge is something I find really fun too. Sort of a side aspect of book conservation is making boxes, and I like that part of it too.
And I guess within the field of conservation, you from time to time you need to make boxes that fit the objects pretty well, or that are specifically built in some strange ways to fit the objects.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add something that we just recorded an episode of our bookish talk with a Finnish book artist and bookbinder, Kaija Rantakari. First, we were discussing that in her opinion, books should be interacted with a lot, and especially as her books that she makes as her artist books, not maybe design bindings and fine bindings, but artist books especially. And the other thing was that she makes really special books, really special boxes for these artist books. So it's just it's never ends to impress me how all our talks are sort of interrelated in this way.
What kind of material do you work daily on? Is it books? Is it ephemera, documents, photographs? How old are they? What's the spectrum here?
Well, I started out with general collections materials. So this is just your standard library books, things that circulate, things that people can check out. That was what I started with. And so I still have a lot of experience with that kind of material. As time has gone on and I've learned more and had more experience, I've gotten more involved with rare books, older books, archival materials, as I was saying. So that includes all kinds of documents, letters, scrapbooks, all kinds of historical materials. So in the archives where I work, it's the history of the college itself. So it only goes back to the founding of the college, which I'm blanking on what year that was right now, but it was, 1800s, so mid 1800s roughly. And then, but the materials in our special collections can be much older than that. So we have some manuscripts, and I know the very oldest materials, which is not really anything I've had to work on myself, but the oldest materials in our special collections are actually some Egyptian papyri. So those are pretty ancient. But I think the majority of the manuscripts in that collection are probably no older than 15th century, some 14th century stuff, I think.
And what are the oldest materials you had a chance to work on?
It's a good question. It's funny. I always sort of forget what it is that I've done in terms of what it is, but I remember what was wrong with it, how it was broken. But yeah, I've certainly worked on some 14th century books, mostly just making nice protective enclosures for things like that. I haven't had a lot of repair work on that kind of old material, but it's something I'm getting more and more interested in, and that's actually part of the impetus for this research that I'm doing, is to learn more about these historical structures, so I feel like I can be more confident in going in and trying to repair them if they're damaged. So yeah, I think at the moment, probably in terms of actual repair, we're talking more like 17th century or later. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty minor stuff so far.
So for your planned series of articles, how would you describe the scope? What do you intend to do? What do you want to have in the end?
Well, it's funny. I tried to limit it as much as I could when I got started. This actually started as part of the American Academy of Bookbinding program, which I know, Stefan, you have taken some courses in that program. For the diploma, one of the requirements is to write a paper, and it's very broad. You can choose almost anything that has to do with books. So I thought, well, I'm really interested in structures and how they've changed over time. So I'm trying to narrow it down as much as I can. So keep it to European books and keep it to printed books, which of course that lasted all of 2 days. And right away off into the manuscripts because they're structurally more interesting.
Yeah.
But I was trying originally to sort of keep it narrow, and it has certainly expanded over time. And now I'm getting more and more interested in the medieval structures because they are so different from modern books in a lot of ways. They have all these components that modern bookbinding just doesn't really tend to focus on. You know, the metal pieces that go on them, and the different styles of sewing and attachment of the boards. All of that stuff has sort of been simplified as time has gone on. So, but I think the older ones are more interesting.
So in your research, how often do you have to go and see the actual book to understand how it's made? Because I really tried to research many of the topics that you cover in your series, and I'm really glad you're doing it because it's very difficult. Say for medieval books, there is our with Stepan's favorite book, Archaeology of Medieval Bookbinding by Jan Shimai. It's a great source, but it's rather limited, and by now it's rather dated. So are there any books you can readily go to now, or do you have to look through articles, through scientific papers, through book reports?
You're right. It's sometimes difficult to know what people are talking about if you don't have an actual book in front of you. It's interesting. I rely on that particular source a lot, and if you take a look at the bibliographies, you can sort of see that one comes up over and over again. It's a great source, and I love the way that he has described things with some statistics. You know, he's actually measured things and looked at all these different collections. So I'm actually hoping that once I've done a lot of the background research that I'm doing now, that I will actually be able to go and look at some of these collections of materials and actually physically see them in person. That would really be outstanding. I haven't gotten to that point yet, although I have been able to look at some of the books in our own special collections at Wellesley and see, you know, here and there examples of some of these structures. We have a great collection there, especially for such a small institution. So it's been nice to have the opportunity to look at those materials. But yes, most of these older books are held in libraries in Europe, and I have not had the opportunity to come and take a look. So it would be ideal if I can do some traveling once the next few articles are done. It looks like I might be able to finish some of this year, what I have planned. We'll see. Things always can change, but at the moment, that's sort of how it looks. I am trying to wind it down. But then, you know, there is some question after I've written the last article that I'm planning on writing for the newsletter, what am I going to do with these things? I've had a couple of people ask, you know, is there some sort of compilation of them somewhere? And I think, well, maybe I'll have to make one.
It's interesting that you mentioned that you like Surmai's approach to bringing lots of statistics about the books he writes about, and I also was always impressed by this, and but then it's funny because sometimes you see that there are some correlations in the data, but sometimes it's just all over the place, and you just cannot make any I forgot the word выводы.
I would say you wouldn't make any conclusions.
Any conclusions? Yeah, thank you very much. Sometimes I blank out on words, not only in English but also in Russian. Well, that's just an upsetting thing about these things, because we don't have enough material to work with.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing about book history, is that books have changed over the centuries, but also individual books have been rebound and repaired. And if if the text block, if the pages are still good, then the binding might have nothing to do with what it originally looked like, because it's easy to replace the binding when it wears out in a lot of ways. I mean, it's work, certainly, but it's certainly something that people have been doing for centuries. So we've lost a lot of these original bindings, and that's a real shame, but it's just sort of part of the history of these objects, is that they've been used and they've been beaten up and fallen apart. And so they need to be, in order to continue to be used, they need a refurbishment or a rebinding. And sometimes the rebinding itself is old too. And so that's also interesting.
Yeah, I think we discussed this with some of our earlier guests, that not only some bindings were lost because of later editions or repairs or something like that, but sometimes almost the whole styles of bindings are almost non-existent, because for example, in 19th and early 20th century they were rebound to keep the insides of the book, and nowadays professionals have to sort of guess how it all worked before, following the holes in the stitch of the old stitching, or some other traces of evidence that may help to recreate the original structures.
Which brings me to can I ask a question? Can I ask a question? Please, please, please. I really want to ask about the earliest evidence that we have. I know that the earliest extant bindings are Coptic bindings, but books were a few centuries old by then. And I know that in early papyrus codices that we have remnants of from Egypt, say from Oxyrhynchus, we can see some holes for binding. But can we actually say what the very first books look like?
Right. I think it's difficult. I think we have to get lucky and find some really old examples, and there are a few, but it's hard to find evidence of these really old bindings. I think we can make some guesses. Unfortunately, I'm not particularly knowledgeable about Coptic bindings. I mean, I know what they look like, and I've made a few, but I think there are some folks out there who know a lot more about it than I do. And so that's a really fascinating part of binding history too, is how did this even get started? And I know there are some arguments about this, of course, which this is the part that I love, is when you get two different authors who disagree about something, and so trying to figure out which one you believe is always fun. But there's some speculation that the codex form is actually inspired by this idea of tablets that were joined with rings, right? So you have these wax tablets, or they must have been wax tablets with wooden frames that had holes through them that were then joined with rings, and that this gives you the idea of the turning pages.
Yeah, I also heard some speculation about clay tablets as well, so I guess maybe not only wax tablets, but
right. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly possible too. You can imagine making a clay tablet in a similar format, right, and have it be joined in some way to another leaf. But I don't know. I mean, that certainly seems possible, but at the same time, I don't know that it's necessarily true, and I don't think anyone does, frankly. But it's an interesting question. How did this start? Whose idea was it to sew pages together so that they could flip over? I mean, it seems like such a natural thing to us because it's been around for centuries, and we all grew up with books. It's a perfectly normal thing for us to use, but somebody had to think about it first. It's kind of the same question. This is something I think about, which makes me a little bit of a strange person, probably. But there are certain things that people eat that I think, okay, who was the first brave person who tried eating this? You know,
Absolutely.
you get a pineapple, right? That
Yeah.
doesn't look like something you want to eat.
Yeah.
It's spiky. It
Yeah.
has, these funny leaves. It doesn't look like a fruit. But if you cut into it, it's actually really delicious. So who was the first person who said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to smash this open and eat it.
And with some dishes, it's like, well, something had to spoil before it was, made to these products, and somebody had to be well, brave or desperate enough to try it after it was spoiled, and then they decided, well, it's a dish. So
Right.
yeah, it's really strange with food.
So I wonder about things like this too. Whose idea was it to make a book? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a bit upsetting because there is this range of at least a couple of 100 years, or maybe up to 1,000 years. That's within which probably the first codices were created, and we don't really know anything about it. And there is only this huge room for speculation and nothing else, at least for now. So I guess we have to hope that some other findings in some really dry and desolate places will help us to uncover new secrets.
I think there might have been some new Dead Sea Scrolls discovered.
Yeah, just a couple of days ago. Yeah, at least
Yeah,
in our timeline, it was a couple of days ago.
right.
About this big. I mean, they're not actual scrolls, but it's good to know. But then it wasn't that long ago, in civilizational terms, that Nag Hammadi codices were found. They were found like 1941, 39, thereabouts. So there's still hope, especially in Egypt. You'd think after centuries and centuries of exploration, we found everything, but we haven't, and that's exciting.
It is.
I also wanted to ask you about how different Coptic and European traditions of binding are. Do they even share a common source? What do you think?
That's a good question too. I think it's important to sort of think about trade over time and how things get from one place to another. So I don't think it was that unusual for people in Europe to be trading with people from Northern Africa. That doesn't seem unlikely to me. So I think there's more than one way that idea could have moved from one place to another. I think some of the earliest European bindings do look like Coptic bindings in some respects. The style of attaching the boards can be a little bit similar. I think it's is it the Stonyhurst Gospel is one of the earliest English bindings, right, that we know of. And that one, certainly the decoration on it has some echoes from some of the Coptic decorations that we've seen. So it's hard to imagine in the ancient world how a book could move from Northern Africa to England. It's kind of a long way to go on foot. But maybe it came by a boat, maybe, who knows. But I do think that there must have been some long distance trade going on that allowed people to learn about these ideas of decoration and structure from one place to another. I mean, people always move, right? There's always a reason for somebody to move from one place to another, and they would have brought materials with them. And if they had a book, it would have been a precious object at that time. So they would have been careful to protect it in their travels and brought it with them. So I think it's not unusual that things have traveled such long distances. It's just hard for us to understand how exactly they did that.
Well, if objects from China or from Africa appear in Viking burials from time to time, so why it's easier for coins to travel for sure, or for some jewelry, but books are more fragile, and well, there are different sorts of objects, but still there is a chance, I guess, for them to move.
I've been thinking about Coptic books, and they do tend to be on the smaller side. So it's not that difficult for them to travel. If you think about Codex Florentianus, the one sent from England to Rome, and it is about this big. It weighs something like 30 kilos. It's enormous. And it almost got there, and it would have gotten there, wasn't it for the death of the carrier, and it stays in Florence at the time. So, and it was something like 8th or 9th century. So we just don't know. Okay, so what do we know of the earliest history of European style bookbinding? Where does it all start? Where are we feeling confident in our knowledge?
And I guess I wanted to add a bit to this question, because in your series of articles, did you find many situations when some traditions and methods started in different locations of Europe and then sort of intersected or not, or competed? How did it go?
Yeah, this is actually what I've been sort of trying to wrap my head around, and why I started making these charts to kind of help me sort out these questions. So the charts are my way of trying to synthesize all this information and sort of figure out where things fit and how they go together, and exactly to see if there are any patterns where you can see things moving from one place to another. Interestingly, there's a lot more documentation about decoration styles, which I haven't gotten to yet. That's coming up soon. But it does seem like there are certain aspects of the structure that seem to have started in one place and then spread out. And you can make some guesses based on the sort of standard trade routes, if you will, how this happened. So there was one thing that I was reading about that talked about choice of leather and working with leather as a covering material. And it seems that this was really maybe started in Spain. And sort of the idea is that because Spain tended to trade with Africa and the Middle East route, you know, they had this sort of foothold into the rest of Europe. So it's an interesting idea that, you know, they were trading other things, and there's a tradition of leatherworking in Spain, right? So it's not surprising that someone there might have been one of the first people to say, oh, well, we can use this to cover a book, or we could use this technique for decorating leather that we've been using on, say, saddles, and apply it to a bookbinding. So I think that kind of thing is not unusual. Most of the information I have doesn't go back further than the Carolingian style, so we're talking like 9th century-ish, but mostly a little bit later than that, just like 10th, 11th century. So that's kind of the earliest stuff that we know a lot about. And figuring out where that started is sort of hard to say. There are a lot of gaps, but it seems like it might have been French. It might have been Italian, you know, somewhere in that Alpine region, and then it might have spread from there. I know a lot less about German bookbinding because I don't speak any German, so it's hard for me to get sources in German and then learn about bookbinding that way. So I've had to rely on translations, and there aren't that many. But I do speak French, so I can actually read these French binding treatises and articles. So that helps me expand my understanding of where things come from, is to be able to look at these articles in in other languages, but my other European languages are a little bit more deficient, so that's harder for me. So it'd be great to collaborate with someone who has like some German or more Italian than I have. So
well, maybe somebody will see this video and will reach out to you. Pavel asked about the probable roots of European styles of binding stemming from Coptic or maybe Ethiopian bindings, but well, through this Spanish route, maybe there was some huge influence coming from Islamic bindings, because Islamic bindings is a world of lots of different styles and traditions, and well, Spain definitely had connections with Morocco and many other places where Islam is a dominant religion and tradition. So.
yes, I also think that another route is through Venice, because the Venetians were traders as well, and they also had a lot of influence from the Islamic world. So I do think that it would be interesting to learn more about Islamic binding and to see how much of these structures come from that tradition, how much of them come from the North African tradition, and just to compare how things have come together. That would be really fascinating.
Just as a reminder, it's that to place this podcast in time, these days Venice celebrates 1600 years since the beginning of its history. So yeah, well, they definitely had a lot of things to share with the world. Pavel, sorry.
And what was going on in the Eastern Roman Empire at the time? Constantinopolitan books, how were they bound at that time?
That's a good question. I don't have any good sources on that. Right, because I was sort of, again, trying to narrow things down to the printed works, and that really just didn't last very long. But yes, that's a really rich tradition of binding as well.
I tried to research that, and almost all sources are either in Greek or in Italian.
Right.
And I mean, so I wanted to ask you, how do you think traditions actually spread? I mean, anyone who's ever tried to bind a book knows that you can't just take a book, look at it. Oh, that's how it's done. You need a master. Was there an actual movement of people involved?
I think there had to be. I mean, it's, as you say, you can, if you are already a bookbinder and you see a book that's been bound a different way, you can make some educated guesses. And if you're really clever, you can figure some things out. But I think you're right. I think a lot of techniques, you need someone to show you how this was done. And I would not be surprised if a lot of that is people moving from one place to another. I think, my medieval history is not very strong, but I do know that there are guilds, and part of being in a guild is this phase that's called a journeyman. And I believe that that means that you travel from one town to another to learn, to sort of hone your craft, right? To learn from different masters. And I think it's not outrageous to suggest that maybe one way to spread bookbinding ideas and techniques is through this phase of becoming a master binder, where you're actually journeying from one town to another and learning from different people. So you're not just learning from people, but you're bringing the knowledge you already have with you. And so I think it makes sense to have it be tied to people traveling from one place to another. And, I think travel was more difficult at the time, but people still did it. There are certain people for whom travel is almost built in, it's ingrained. They want to move from one place to another. And I think that's been true for as long as there have been people. So I think it's probably not surprising that when people go from one place to another, they bring what they know with them. And so that's how things can spread.
Did you see in your research some examples of this sort of branching of traditions from one place to another, from one country to another? Because at least in the 19th and 20th century, we definitely can see how some bookbinding masters influenced generations of their students and followers, and sometimes this traditional approach continued for many years. But is there something that is as visible in the medieval traditions?
Yes, I think I'm scrolling through my charts right now to see if I can get a really good example. But certainly, like, there are certain innovations that seem to start in one place and then show up somewhere else. And, part of that is that there may not be great evidence of something earlier happening in both places, if that makes sense. But it does seem like, for example, rounding the spine with a hammer is something that didn't always happen. Like, that took a while before people decided to do this deliberately. Books sort of naturally take on a round, but actually using a tool in order to shape that in a deliberate way seems to have started in Germany. And it doesn't seem to show up in other places until later. So, a century or two. Now, I don't have a full suite of evidence of this, but it looks like that kind of procedure started in Germany sometime in the 15th century, but it didn't reach England until later in the 16th century. So that's something where we can make a guess that the idea started further south and it traveled further north. But it's sort of, you get back to this question of absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So we're sort of making guesses about this, but it seems plausible, right? That somebody had this idea to do this deliberately, to shape the spine. And then somebody else said, hey, that works really well. I'm going to start doing that too. And then it travels from one place to another. And, I think sometimes people are making things up and they just try it. And if it works, somebody else says, yeah, I'm going to do that too. And then it spreads. But, it's hard to say these things.
And what about the other way to transfer information, which is writing it down? So 15th, 16th century, it's already the early printed book period. I'm not sure when, but it's about early 16th century when first printed manuals talking about how to make a book appear. Was there any tradition of bookbinding manuals before that? Because I've never heard about any manuscripts that would go into technical details.
That's a really good question. I've certainly never heard of any. That doesn't mean they didn't exist, but if they're manuscript, they may just not have much dissemination, right? So there may only be a handful of copies. Also, this is something that I think would not have survived very well, right? Because if you have a book that you're using as a manual, it gets a different kind of use than something you just read for pleasure or for study. It's if you're using something as a technical manual, it's going to get more abuse.
It's like it is with medical books. We only have very lavish presentation copies of just codices. We don't have a single working copy.
Right, exactly, because it's probably been damaged so many times that it's considered by someone to be beyond repair, and it was maybe discarded, which is horrifying to think about. But it's the nature of books that are used that we don't tend to have them as much. If you think about cookbooks, we don't have a lot of very old cookbooks, do we? And that's for the same kind of reason, is that if you're using it in your shop, it's going to get beaten up and it's going to fall into disrepair and at some point be replaced. And so it's hard to find those really old manuals. So I don't know of any manuscript manuals. It would be great if someone found one. I think that would be fantastic. But yes, it's true that once things got printed, there were enough copies laying around that some of them have survived.
And what would be the earliest one that you're aware of?
It's a good question. There's, I know what I should do. I should look up in my bibliography.
Yeah, I think we just recently discussed this with some of our guests that for English and Dutch books, the earliest manuals were printed in early 19th century. So it's not long ago. For German, I think it wasn't 16. I think it was 17th century or something like that. But still, yeah, I'm a bit surprised and a lot upset that there weren't earlier printed books describing how to make books.
Let's see. I've got a 1763 from France. And 1770s. So yeah. Oh, there's a 1689. Oh, Jean de la Caille. That one's pretty old, but earlier than that, I think it's difficult to find.
This is really strange. I mean, these are book people. Why aren't they making books about themselves?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, possibly you could say that so much of training in bookbinding was done hands-on, and with the master teaching the apprentices. And so much of it is almost an oral tradition, right? It's a craft education, but passed on person to person, whereas it's less likely that people were trying to learn from scratch without having someone to show them. And so that's when you really would be looking to a manual, as if you're trying to learn something on your own. And so maybe there wasn't as much demand for that kind of thing. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
I mean, we think of manuals for things and instructions for things as being quite common. You can find all kinds of tutorials online. You can download instructions for almost anything. I mean, even something as simple as a knitting pattern, you can get that anywhere. But I think that's kind of a modern invention. I don't think that was the case for a long time. So even though it was possible to print these manuals, I don't know how likely it was that people wanted them. We want them. We want them to have written everything. But I don't know that was necessarily common before now.
I just checked my small digital collection and found this book that was recommended to me as at least one of the oldest German books on bookbinding. And it's Buchbinderkunst by Johann Gottfried Zeidler.
Yeah.
And it's 1708. So I was mistaken. It wasn't 17th century. It was early 18th century. So yeah, once again, it's only 300 years ago. So not long ago.
Which brings me to my next question. It's even more surprising for me, given that there were no manuals. There wasn't that much movement of people, at least that we know of. Say, German bookbinders would mostly journey through German lands. And yet, European tradition of bookbinding is relatively coherent.
Mm.
Which, considering that there were dozens, maybe 100 bookbinders for the whole Europe, say, in the 9th century, it couldn't have been many more than that. There have been something like a few thousand Carolingian manuscripts produced in the whole era. So right. There wouldn't have been need for that many bookbinders. A few hundred books in Ireland, a few dozen books here, a few dozen books there. So a few dozen bookbinders would have made that. Why were they working in the same tradition? How did it work?
That's a really good question. I think too that because these books these earliest books were handmade, they were handwritten, and they're very precious, they're very expensive to create. There wasn't a huge demand for a lot of copies of things. Most people didn't know how to read anyway. So what's, you know, but yes, how does that spread? How do we end up with this fairly coherent book culture? And that's really interesting. I think maybe part of the answer is that what works well. And so if you see a book that functions well, you're going to want to make your books look like that and work like that. So especially some of the earlier structures, I think they're so robust and they're so strong and they take a long time to produce, but they work. And so if it works, it's going to spread. And I don't know if that's really answering your question, because there's obviously more to it than that. But it is interesting to see that this sort of commonality of structure. But you can also see how it subtly can shift a little bit. Each bookbinder is going to do something a little bit different. They're each going to have their own interpretation of the same structure. And, you know, as books have sort of gotten bashed around over the centuries, it's sort of harder sometimes to see some of those subtle differences. But I think they're probably there. But I think that it's more about that it works, and so people are going to keep doing it, and they're going to keep trying it in different places. Yeah, that's a really good question.
Were there then some experiments that didn't work? Like nobody makes Gödel books anymore, except for a few people we talked to. But were there any other types of structures that just didn't take off?
Well, I think what you often see is more that something was too slow to do or too expensive to produce. And so it fell out of favor. So you can see this in the sewing in particular, right? The most robust sewing takes a long time because it's sewing over a double support. Each sewing station, you got to go out, you got to loop around a couple of times and go back in. If you do that for every single signature and you've got one of those really large books, that's going to take a long time. And it seems to me like a lot of the shift in structure over the centuries is driven more by economic concerns and wanting to speed up production. Sewing is the most time-consuming part of making a book. And anything you can do to speed that up, people were going to try. Probably some of the things that they tried didn't work and they haven't survived. And so we don't really have, we don't have any remaining examples of some of those things that didn't work very well, but we can see what people were trying. So one of the things that they tried to do was to skip some of the sewing stations on some of the signatures. So you find these patterns where maybe there are 3 chords or 4 chords, but in any given signature, they've only used 2 of them. And then in the next signature, they've used the other 2 that they didn't use in the previous one. So that's a way to kind of speed things up. And you can see that in some of the, I think it's some of the German bindings that I've seen people looking at. That seems to have been one way to sort of speed things up. Another way is to try and sew 2 signatures on together. So you kind of alternate from one to the other, which has a similar effect, right? You're cutting in half the number of stitches you have to make. Mm-hmm. Another is reducing the number of cords that you use, the number of supports. If you have a single support, you only have to loop around it once, and then you go back in. I've actually found that for me personally is harder to sew, because when you have a double support, the 2 supports are one on either side of your sewing hole, right? Mm-hmm. So when you come out between the cords, they don't get in your way. Whereas if you've got a single cord, it's right in front of the hole, you try to come out and sew and the cord's right in the way. So it's actually more fiddly. So I think, oddly enough, trying to reduce the number of supports at a single station doesn't actually speed things up. you think it will, but it doesn't because it's actually more fiddly. But if you reduce the number of sewing stations, then yes, that does make things go faster. If you switch to an unsupported stitch, that goes quickly too, but then you have to figure out how you're going to attach your covers. So you had to come up with other ways to make those connections if you were going to do that.
And if the covers are made of wood, there are really not many good ways to attach them that's in a way that they wouldn't be, easily removed or damaged.
Exactly. And so I think that's something that people have certainly tried. Probably the most successful change in sewing patterns that I can think of, or successful in the sense of being adopted by a lot of people, but structurally not very successful, is the idea of recessed cords. So this is where you have your spine and you cut little grooves in the spine. So the cord actually sits in a notch in the signature. So when you're sewing, you don't actually wrap around that cord, you just tuck behind it. And it kind of helps to pull the cord into the signature. This is very fast. If you tried to sew this way, it's really quick and it's therefore really cheap because you can have people do it quickly. And if you're only paying them, by the hour, then they're able to crank out a lot more books per hour. So this is good economics. However, a lot of 19th century books are bound this way and they don't last very well because you've got this huge notch that you've cut in the spine. And when you glue up the spine, all the glue gets in there. So it glues the spine together in a very solid way, and it's hard to open that book. So you're putting a lot of strain on it when you open it. And so that puts a lot of stress on those cords, it puts a lot of stress on the sewing, and the cords tend to break because the cords themselves are actually made of fairly cheap materials as well. So this experimentation, it worked very well for the binders at the time, and it was quick and it was cheap and people bought a lot of these books. And because they made and bought a lot of them, there are a lot of them out there, but it's the kind of thing that breaks down pretty quickly. And so it's not very structurally successful. But when you have a lot of them, and they're not very old too, you have a lot that survive. And so you see very many of them, but that doesn't mean that that's a good structure. It just was a cheap structure.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the 19th century, 19th century and the early 20th century, maybe throughout 20th century, is about structures that are not really durable and looking for more and more ways to make books cheaper and faster to produce. And I'm sure that many of these books wouldn't survive, couple more centuries or something like that. Some of them didn't survive the 20th century.
But then it was bound to happen when you have a few thousand books produced for the whole Europe. You can sew and be very meticulous, but then the book production grows exponentially from 16th century on. Has it influenced in any other ways binding traditions? And what about a switch from parchment to paper? Because it's another material. Did it facilitate the change?
Yeah, that makes a huge difference, actually. Parchment is so reactive to the environment. It doesn't lie flat, it changes with humidity. So medieval books, the older ones, are really robust. They have these thick wooden boards, they have metal clasps to hold them shut, because if you make a parchment text block and don't clamp it down, it's gonna fly open. So they really had to engineer the heck out of these things to keep them closed. But and the earliest paper manuscripts were treated the same way. They have these heavy boards, they have heavy metal clasps, they have all this extra attention put on keeping them closed. And it didn't probably take very long for people to realize, wait, this is kind of overkill. We don't need to be taking this much trouble to hold something shut if it's just going to hold itself shut on its own. We don't need to be putting all this extra work into it, right? So I think the switch from parchment to paper was a huge change in bookbinding structure because they didn't need to fight against it. It's its own material nature. It doesn't fight you when you make a book out of paper, but if you make a book out of parchment, it does. It reacts very differently. Another sort of interesting thing about parchment is that because it's not a flat material, the thickness of a text block that's made from parchment is pretty even. It's not thicker at the spine than it is at the foredge because the whole book is sort of more full of air. It puffs itself up because it's not lying flat. Whereas paper, you can smash paper together really compactly. And it's easy to sort of compress the main part of the text block. But the spine has the sewing thread in it and the fold, and that takes up more space. So that's a big part of why early books have these flat spines, because they're made of parchment.
Yep.
They have an equal dimension all the way across, but a paper text block has this extra thickness at the spine. And so that's why they start to develop this rounded shape, is that they've got extra bulk there. So they're trying to stay flat across, but because it's thicker at one end, it's squeezing out the excess. And that's how that rounded spine developed.
So we finished discussing how the tradition changed inevitably when the paper technology came, and then when book printing started. Were there any other seismic shifts, any other big events that you can trace in the actual bookbindings?
Well, I think definitely the advent of printing as opposed to manuscripts made a big difference in structures, because you suddenly had this explosion of available texts and copies. So there was that, coupled with the fact that a lot more people were educated and literate and therefore wanted copies of books. That really drove this idea of speeding up processes and cutting corners and taking shortcuts and making things faster and cheaper to produce. So the combination of printing plus greater literacy and just a greater demand. So you also have this shift in what is being produced, right? So when you're creating a manuscript book, most of these texts are religious texts and perhaps some educational texts, but mostly religious scholarship. And then once you have printing and you have this increased literacy and you have this sort of revolution in thought, you have a wider variety of subjects being written about and published about. And so there's a greater variety of material available to readers. And so there's just more and more demand for books. And so there's more and more demand for books to be provided quickly and cheaply. And so that definitely changed things. I mean, sewing is the really obvious situation, but the idea of lacing on the boards changed, right? So this was a major part of early bookbinding, is attaching the boards to the text block. And you did this as part of the sewing, typically. Whereas in a case binding, you're doing it as a separate operation. You create the text block in one place, you create the cover in another place, and then you have to bring them together. So that's actually one of the more recent articles that I wrote was about how do you attach the boards. And in medieval books, there were a lot of ways to attach boards that were made of wood. So you could drill holes in them in lots of different directions, and you could cut these channels to recess your cords or your thongs so that they didn't produce big bumps on the surface. So there are a lot of variations. And this is where you actually see more specialization, right? Different locations come up with different ways to attach their boards. But once there was a shift away from using these heavy wooden boards and into this cheaper material that's made from paper pulp, the sort of pulp boards that you get in a more modern book, you can drill holes in those, and people did for quite some time, but it was sort of considered to be an expense that maybe we could do away with. So how do you attach your boards if you're not going to actually drill holes through them and lace sewing supports through them? So a quicker way and a cheaper way to attach the cover to the book is something that people were trying to do. And so you come up with the case binding. And the only attachment between a cased binding and the text block is usually two things. It's the end sheets, which are pasted down. And sometimes there's a spine lining as well that's part of the attachment. And usually that's actually the more important part of the attachment, the more structurally sound part of the attachment. So you have a spine lining that you then have wider than your spine, and then the edges of that get glued to your boards, and that's a big part of how to attach. So yeah, that's definitely something else that changed, and that you can see that before modern printed books, you didn't really see that, or if it did exist, it hasn't survived. That doesn't mean it didn't, but I don't think it did, because there was so much effort being put into making these robust objects that could last for a long period of time. And the case binding just doesn't have that same strength of attachment. And so it's a lot easier for that to fail, for that to break. On the other hand, that also means it's a lot easier to repair because you can just replace it with a new cover. Actually, probably the earlier version of that is the limp vellum binding. This is something that was durable, but also designed to be replaceable. So it's still something that's sewn onto a support. It's sewn on usually alum tawed thongs, right? And then those thongs are laced through just a layer of parchment or vellum. So vellum is really strong and it's pretty durable, but it can get beaten up. And if it got too bad, you could just replace it with a fresh one. And so it's kind of like a paperback, but better, because you can just slip the cover off and put a new one on. So like that's actually a fairly old version, but the case binding is a pretty new one. And I don't think it was intended to be replaceable, but it has proven to be something that you can actually replace without having to completely resew it or put in new sewing supports that then have to get laced into a new cover. You don't have to do that. You can just replace the cover with fresh end sheets typically, or fresh spine linings. So I think that's an innovation that was driven partly by this demand for cheap books for everyone.
This is so amazing. I learned so many things already, and things that I never even thought to think about, because the just like with parchment and the flatness of the book, or the fact that you use tutorials and they don't survive. I just didn't even think about it. But yeah, that's so true. So thank you very much for that. I guess we need to finish this episode. It was a great to talk to you, Emily, and I wanted to add that we will add links to your articles, to PDFs of your articles below in the description, as well as a link to the website of the Guild of Bookworkers. And I wanted to ask everybody to like this video, share, subscribe to our channel, join the crowd on Patreon, and maybe become one of our paid members, because it's really important to us. We cover editing of these videos with the money that comes from our patrons, and without them we wouldn't be here. Thank you. Thanks to everybody, and bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.